A couple of years back, I had an idea that I should really try and cover a format that's been intriguing me for quite some time now, namely High Definition Laserdisc. Yeah, it's something that not many people know about. They are normal size Laserdiscs, but they do contain high definition video, or Hi-Vision as it was known in Japan, and it's encoded on here using the MUSE system. So I spent the last couple of years getting everything together, namely some discs and a machine to play them on, decoder, all that kind of stuff. And it's possibly the worst idea that I've ever had, because at the end of this, it's cost me about £3,000. And all I've got to show for it are a few discs that I can't play in my now broken Hi-Vision MUSE Laserdisc player. But for a brief period of time, it was working just long enough to make the video that you're about to see now. Right, it's one of the hottest days of the year, and I'm here in my garage with all these lights on, trying to show you how early MUSE Laserdisc was when it comes to home HD video formats for pre-recorded movies. So I've got a 20-year timeline here, and I'm going to put a few things on here just to show you how it all fits together. So let's start off with something most people should recognise. We've got HD DVD and Blu-ray that came out within 3 or 4 months of each other in 2006. Now that's the first opportunity most normal people would have had to go and buy a player and watch HD movies in their own home off a pre-recorded format. Now of course with these things you're not going to get everyone buying it on day one. There's always a really slow adoption. Just to give an example of that, DVD, it's always mentioned that it came out in 1996. And it did, in Japan, right at the end of '96. In the US, it came out sort of in the spring of '97, I think March or April or something like that. But nobody probably bought it then, well, very few people, because it was really expensive. In the sales figures for 1997 in the US, in the percentage of households that had adopted a DVD as a home video format, came back at 0% for 1997. Now, of course, there will be some people, but it was so low it didn't even register. 1998, you get up to 1%, and that's the point when I bought into DVD. 1998, I imported a machine, or got an imported machine from Japan, and I was the first person that I knew out of, I was working in a company that had perhaps a couple of hundred people, the first one who had a DVD player. And I remember bringing it back one lunchtime from the shop that I bought it from, and somebody says, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's a DVD player." And I said, "What?" I said, "Yes, movies on a disc." Movies on a disc? It was the most incredulous response ever. It's still stuck in my mind to this day. Movies on a disc, like the most weird thing. Now, you've got to remember, Laserdisc had been out since 1978 or something like that. But nobody really paid any attention to it, and nobody really knew about it in the general public anyway. But yeah, 1996, DVD. It took till 2006 it got to 85% of US households, but back in 96 basically nobody bought it, and that's why I'm mentioning this. Even though HD DVD and Blu-ray came out in 2006, you've got to look sort of probably a few years on before most people even thought about buying a machine that could play it, or they got a PlayStation, whatever it is, and got a couple of discs if they did get any. Right, so let's just think, so 2006-ish, let's find out where MUSE fits in. 1993, so this is in Japan. So that's the first time people in Japan with a lot of money, I'll go into that later, could buy a home HD video format with pre-recorded movies on it. 1993. Right, so that is, I mean, look at that, that's 13 years span between those two. Now I've got to say, back in the US, if you were kind of really into your home cinema, you could have got a D-Theatre machine in 2002. I've done a video about D-Theatre. It's HD movies MPEG 2 on SVHS tapes. I'll put a link to that in the video description. Now, just to show you, the MUSE died very quickly, 1997, so it didn't have much of a span at all, 93 to 97. And you might think that, okay, well, that was something to do with something else taking over, whatever. That kind of just died out. It was too expensive. I mean, just to put it in perspective, Laserdisc, that had existed since the late 70s, well, 1995 was the first time you could get AC3 Laserdisc, also known as Dolby Digital. So it was around this point Laserdisc really started sort of taking off as a home collector's movie format. Before the 90s, it hadn't really had much of an impact there at all. It was sort of with things like AC3 and DTS in 1997. So, you know, that's really late in the format's life. Just to give you an idea, the last Laserdisc title that you could have bought in Japan was in 2001. And the last Laserdisc machine was made in 2009. Now, you think that's a bit weird, but I suppose people just like to buy machines for their old collection when their old machine dies. In fact, just to mention that, 2002 was the last time you could get a MUSE machine that could play these Laserdiscs here, these HD Laserdiscs. But really, I think people were buying these, not to play the MUSE discs where the last one came out in 97, but because they're particularly good Laserdisc players in their own right. So even if you don't have any MUSE discs, this was a good machine to buy if you were really into your Laserdisc. So there you go, that's how it all fits together. A bit of a long-winded way to say it, but look, 13 years before most people got the chance to buy an HD format on a disc, people were buying an HD format on a disc. Japan was the first country in the world to start regular high-definition television broadcasts, although they preferred to call it Hi-Vision. In 1991, they began broadcasting 8 hours a day of what they called test broadcasts, but these could be viewed by any member of the general public, provided that they had the suitable equipment in their home. Now, just like the very first experimental Hi-Vision broadcasts from 1989, these were transmitted to the home via the BS2 satellite. Hi-Vision Laserdisc came along a couple of years later. It was really just a physical carrier for the same system, and it was a joint collaboration between 5 major Japanese manufacturers. And this was the first major update to Laserdisc in the 14 years since it was originally launched. Since the 1960s, NHK, the Japanese national broadcaster, had been working on a successor to the NTSC system that they'd inherited from the US. This book from 1993 lays out their new Hi-Vision system in an attempt to sell it to the rest of the world. It explains how they decided early on that their new system should double the resolution of NTSC, and Hi-Vision does just that. Rather than having 525 lines, it's got 1,125. Some of these are lost to overscanning, leaving 1,035 usable lines, and in practice 1,032 of these are active. The book is very technical but also fascinating in explaining how they came to various decisions, such as the 16:9 screen aspect ratio that we're used to nowadays. They determined that people would sit nearer to a screen if the image was sharper, and therefore the screen would need to be wider to fill out more of the peripheral vision. The book also includes a 1993 vision of the future where they suggest that television displays are expected to become flat panels that can be hung on a wall, possibly even using plasma technology. Imagine that. At the bottom of the page they named the compression system that made it possible to transmit this Hi-Vision signal using the same amount of bandwidth as a standard definition one. It's something called MUSE. A raw Hi-Vision video signal would require 20 MHz to transmit, which didn't fit into the space allocated for one channel. Multiple Subnyquist sampling encoding, or MUSE, was a compression system that took this 20 MHz signal and squashed it down to a more manageable 8 MHz for transmission. The viewer at the other end receiving the signal would then use a MUSE decoder to uncompress it back into Hi-Vision video. MUSE required quite a bit of processing power to compress and uncompress, so only really became viable as a consumer product in the early 90s due to the advancements in semiconductor technology. As the only Hi-Vision broadcasts were delivered in the MUSE format, if you bought a Hi-Vision TV, it would more often than not have a MUSE decoder built in, although separate decoders were also available. Because MUSE is just the compression system rather than the end result, the HD Laserdiscs are prominently labelled as Hi-Vision, with MUSE being relegated to the small print on the back. It's much the same as a DVD. You wouldn't refer to one of those as an MPEG-2 disc. One thing I haven't mentioned up to this point is the Hi-Vision audio standard, so let's go into that now. Okay, we're back at the board. It's not going to take us long this time, I promise. I just want to talk about the audio that's on a MUSE Laserdisc. You see, MUSE came out in May 93. Normal Laserdisc got Dolby Digital, aka AC3, in January 95 and got DTS in January 97. So of course it's preceding both of those. It doesn't have either of these formats on MUSE. It's got its own, and it's called DANCE. And this stands for Digital PCM Audio, nearly instantaneously compressed and expanded. There were two versions of this system. B mode was used for stereo broadcasts and discs. It gives two discrete channels at 16-bit 48 kHz. The other variant, A mode, is the surround sound system. That's commonly the one used on the Hi-Vision movies. It's a discrete 4-channel system. You've got front, left and right stereo and a centre channel and one rear surround channel. However, the audio quality is a reduction from the 2-channel system as it uses 32 kHz at 12-bit. And note there's no separate subwoofer output channel here as well. On the disc, this is referred to as 3-1, 3 across the front and 1 rear surround, although most people would use a system to split the rear channel into 2 so that they could better fill the rear of the room with audio, and both speakers, when you do this, would of course be playing the same thing as each other. Moving on to the discs themselves, let's have a look what titles were available on Hi-Vision in Japan, and thanks to the incredibly useful Laserdisc database we've got a comprehensive list. Initially, looking at this, it seems like there are lots of titles, but when you look a bit closer you see that a good proportion of them are videos of fish. I think this is because you could buy an artificial fish tank which utilised a Hi-Vision display in conjunction with a Hi-Vision Laserdisc player, so these are discs of new fish to restock your tank. So if you take away the fish, many of the titles left are really just demonstration discs that contain footage of things like scenery, museums and artwork. Now, I went through the list counting up the traditional movie titles and it came to just over 30. These discs at 18 to 20,000 yen each cost about 2.5 times the price of a normal Laserdisc, but the real cost came in the rest of the equipment. According to this 1994 article from the Laserdisc UK website, a HD CRT TV with a screen size of approximately 30 inches combined with a Hi-Vision Laserdisc player would have cost the equivalent then of £10,000 UK. Just to put that price in perspective with something that most people can relate to, in the UK at the time a basic Mazda MX-5 would have cost a bit less than £15,000. If I go back and put that Laserdisc release list into date order, it reveals that the last Hi-Vision LD title released was Jumanji on the 21st of December 97. But that's quite a big gap after the previous movie, which was Showgirls, and that was released in March 1997, 9 months earlier. But then you have to go all the way back to August 1996 before you find the previous one to that, which was Out of Africa. By the time of those last releases, DVD was already on the scene, and whilst it wasn't an HD format, for many people the quality was good enough. It was more convenient than standard Laserdisc and considerably cheaper than Hi-Vision. Whilst the early sales figures for DVD might have just been a blip, they would have still eclipsed all the previous years of Hi-Vision Laserdisc sales. The real thing, though, that DVD signalled was the end of analogue video formats and the fact that the Hi-Vision MUSE system was already out of date by the time it made its way to market. And nowhere is this more clearly demonstrated by the fact that the magazine I showed you at the beginning that was talking about high definition television in Japan, well, that came from the May 1991 issue of Popular Science, but just 6 months later the same magazine had an article about digital HDTV. It was clear to everyone that digital was going to be the future, and the MUSE system, whilst getting there first, definitely wasn't going to be the way forward. It reminds me a lot of the early days of television, with John Logie Baird doing a lot of the pioneering work with his mechanical television system, and it was the first one used by the BBC for regular broadcasts in the 1930s, but ultimately it was a dead end. It was Farnsworth's system using a CRT that was clearly going to be the system that would be adopted going forward. That's not to say that the work put into both mechanical TV and the MUSE compression system weren't incredibly impressive, pioneering and transformative. It's just the alternative systems were superior. It wasn't all for nothing though. Like many people, I still watch a large screen 16:9 aspect ratio HD TV that's mounted on the wall and has a surround sound audio system. So that's the history and most of the techie stuff out of the way. Let's move back to the present day, and I'm going to show you the equipment that I've bought as well as the discs that I'm going to play on it. So first off, the player is a Pioneer Hl Dx9. This is the last model of Hi-Vision player Pioneer made all the way up to 2002. The MUSE decoder is a Victor HVMD2. Victor, of course, being the Victor company of Japan, and if you rearrange those letters you get the more familiar acronym that we use in the West of JVC. The MUSE decoder outputs its HD video to a television over component. I've got 3 Hi-Vision discs. I've got Cliffhanger, Jurassic Park and Back to the Future, and I've bought all these things over the last couple of years. But let's just look at what some of the current UK eBay prices are. So if you're going to buy one of these players, expect to pay between £2,500 and £4,500, no doubt, plus import duties on top of that. A working decoder, well, that's about £500, and this is the one that might shock you, between £400 to £600 for one of these movies on a Hi-Vision disc. So let's have a look what you get for your money. Well, as you can see, the artwork on here is a little bit different to your normal Laserdisc cover. This is one of the Panasonic range of discs, and they have this theme that runs throughout where they've got a single colour on them, whether it's silver or gold, and then the artwork for the film just goes across the centre part of it. Now it's protected by an outer cardboard slipcover, and inside there you get this large format booklet which tells you about the film. We've also got a leaflet in here that tells us how best to remove the disc from the cardboard cover that's this thing here, and it's a little bit like some of the early DVD cases in a way, where you've got a cardboard folder, and when you open it up, behind this piece of protective tissue paper, we've got the disc held in this plastic section at the back, and it's clamped in using the usual kind of CD type clamp through the centre of the disc. Just like a standard Laserdisc, one of these Hi-Vision MUSE discs can hold 2 hours of video. That's 60 minutes per side. So that's just enough to hold the Back to the Future film on one disc, because it's got a total running time of 116 minutes. If it went across 2 hours, they'd have to split it across 3 sides, meaning they'd sell it as a 2-disc package, which would lead to a higher retail price. Now, because I'm using this in the UK, I'm using a step-down power transformer, but not this little weedy thing here. I'm using something that's got a little bit more capabilities, because I'm going to be powering the Laserdisc player and the MUSE decoder at the same time. While a Hi-Vision Laserdisc might look very similar to a normal one, there are quite a few differences. Firstly, the MUSE discs operate at 12.5 MHz of bandwidth, and in order to provide this, they need to spin at a higher velocity of a maximum of 2,700 RPM. That's half as fast again as a standard NTSC disc, which gets up to 1,800 RPM. The size of the pits on the disc remain the same, but the tracks themselves are packed closer together, down from 1.67 microns apart to 1.1. And as the laser needs to be more accurate to read this, instead of using an infrared laser, as on the normal Laserdisc players, a Hi-Vision player uses a red laser that can operate at 670 nanometers instead of 780. And all that would be fine if it worked. Unfortunately, my machine doesn't. I found out to my cost a couple of years after buying it and then getting my first Hi-Vision disc, it wouldn't play it. It plays normal discs fine, but when you put a Hi-Vision one in, it goes up to that additional speed and comes up with this P5 error. Looking up online, it appears that that might be a problem with the power supply. So I managed to trace somewhere in the US that was selling the power supply still for this model. I imported one at considerable cost. And then when it got here, the guy at the door wanted another £60 of import duty. So all in, this thing cost me about £300. I'm still not entirely sure whether this was the thing that will resolve my problem. But there's only one way to find out, and that's to put it in the machine. So here's my naive plan. I was just going to open this up, look for that power board in there, unplug the various connectors that are attached to it, swap it out with the new one I've got, put the thing back together, and fingers crossed it was going to work. Unfortunately, when I got the covers off this thing is a lot more complicated than I ever thought. I've got no idea where this thing even fits in here. This is the most densely packed piece of electronics that I've ever opened up. So I got the torch out and started looking around, trying to find out exactly where my power supply board would fit. And there's no way to get the bottom off this. Everything has to come out of the top. It's all in a big sandwich of layers. So I thought I'll open this board up here, have a look underneath there. And again, there's just the mechanism for reading the disc, the loading mechanism. But it turns out the power supply board is all the way down on the bottom at the right-hand side, where I'm shining my torch now. It's not the one on the side, it's underneath that one right at the bottom. You see the tops of the caps there. So to get to that, you just have to take everything out. There's the edge of it, and there's the edge of the one that I've got. So I looked at this, I thought, I don't know, I've bitten off more than I can chew here. I don't think I could take this apart. So I decided to put the whole thing back together again, and I went looking for a repairman in my area that would be able to install that power supply in this Laserdisc player. Unfortunately, I actually managed to find one. And he was very reasonably priced. It's about an hour's round trip from my house to take the things to him, but it was definitely worth the effort after spending all that money on that player. This is the power supply that came out of it, and the one that I gave him is now inside the machine. There's no obvious damage to this one. I made sure to put a mark on the one he was putting in it just to make sure he did swap it over, because I'd never used him before. But yeah, sure enough, he put the power supply in that I gave him, and it's now functioning properly. So you put a Hi-Vision disc in, and it starts off, it spins at the normal Laserdisc speed, and then it recognises that it's a Hi-Vision disc. It moves up to those higher RPMs, and HD pops up on the screen, and it starts playing the disc normally. But that's where we're going to have to leave part one of this two-part video, because I'm aware we've gone past the 20-minute mark where many people tend to zone out, and there's still plenty more left to cover. So whilst you're watching this, I've been working on finishing the final part, in which I go into more detail about how everything fits together, and more importantly, I plan to show you some captures of Hi-Vision discs being played and do some comparisons of those against a standard Laserdisc and a Blu-ray. But that's all for next time. Part 2 should follow along in a few days. Subscribe and press the bell to get notified when it's ready to watch. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.